Racist cop crossed the line at a pharmacy, one sentence changed everything. I'm going to need you to step back from the counter, ma'am, right now. This opening line detonates with unearned authority and presumed guilt, establishing immediate high-stakes conflict rooted in racial bias and the abuse of power. The audience is thrust into a moment of confrontation without context, left to wonder what transgression could possibly justify such aggression, and whether the protagonist will submit or resist. The demand itself reveals everything. Laura Bennett has done nothing wrong, yet she is being treated as a threat simply for existing in this space. The scene unfolds in a sterile Rite Aid pharmacy on the corner of Madison and Grove, where fluorescent lights cast everything in a sickly pallor and the smell of antiseptic mingles with institutional indifference. Laura Bennett stands at the pharmacy counter in a crisp white button-up blouse, her box braids pulled into an elegant updo, her posture radiating the kind of dignified composure that comes from preparing for battles you hoped you'd never have to fight. Behind the counter, a pharmacist named Trevor has been stalling for 12 minutes, claiming he needs to verify her prescription, the same prescription she's filled here monthly for 2 years. Behind Laura, Officer James Whitman fills the doorway with the confidence of a man who has never faced consequences, his hand already resting on his belt, his jaw set in a line that suggests this confrontation was inevitable the moment he received the call. This is not a random encounter. This is the collision of a woman who has learned to document everything and a system that has learned it never has to answer for anything. The 911 call that brought Whitman here, claiming a suspicious person causing a disturbance, will eventually be played in federal court, dissected by expert witnesses, and become Exhibit A in a case that will dismantle careers and expose rot that has been festering for years. Before we continue, like, share, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for stories like this, and justice to all. Laura Bennett had been standing at the pharmacy counter for 12 minutes. 12 minutes that felt calculated, deliberate, like a test she hadn't agreed to take. The prescription was simple, lisinopril, 10 milligrams, the same blood pressure medication she'd filled at this exact Rite Aid on Madison and Grove for the past 2 years. Same pharmacy. Same pharmacist. Same routine that had never required verification before today. Trevor, the pharmacist with thinning hair and a name tag slightly askew, had disappeared into the back twice, claiming he needed to verify with the prescribing physician. Laura's complete medical history sat in their system, 2 years of records, every refill documented, every transaction smooth until the pattern she'd been watching for finally emerged. She noted the time on her watch, 2:23 p.m. The recording pen in her shirt pocket had been running since she entered, its small microphone capturing everything. Behind her, 3 customers who'd arrived after her had already been served. An elderly white woman with an expired insurance card. A middle-aged white man who'd forgotten his ID entirely. A young white couple picking up antibiotics. All processed without question, without delay, without the sudden need for verification. "Excuse me," Laura said, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who knows they're being watched. "Can you give me an update on when my prescription will be ready?" Trevor's shoulders tensed. He turned from the computer screen, his expression shifting into something defensive, almost aggressive. "Ma'am, I already told you I'm working on it. You need to be patient." The shift in his tone was stark, from apologetic delay to barely concealed hostility. Laura had heard this exact escalation described in 3 separate incident reports filed by other black residents of Millbrook County. The pattern was consistent: manufactured delay, defensive aggression, then the call. Trevor's hand moved toward the phone beneath the counter. Laura's heart rate elevated slightly, but her face remained composed. She'd been preparing for this moment for 23 days. "Yes, I need an officer at Rite Aid on Madison and Grove," Trevor said into the phone, his eyes locked on Laura with something close to vindication. "There's a woman here causing a disturbance, refusing to leave the counter." Laura hadn't raised her voice. Hadn't moved from her spot. Hadn't done anything except exist while black and ask a reasonable question. The recording pen captured every word. The performance had begun. 6 hours earlier, Laura's alarm pierced the pre-dawn silence at 6 a.m. She rose immediately, muscle memory from 23 consecutive mornings of the same ritual. Her modest one-bedroom apartment in the Riverside district had been transformed into something between a war room and an evidence archive. One entire wall was covered with a carefully constructed timeline, printouts of incident reports arranged by date, news articles about suspicious deaths and unexplained accidents, photographs of officers with red string connecting them to complaints that had mysteriously vanished from official records. In the kitchen, her morning arsenal waited on the counter. The medication bottle, lisinopril, 10 milligrams, legitimately prescribed, the perfect excuse for her routine visits. The recording pen, fully charged, indistinguishable from an ordinary ballpoint. A worn paperback copy of Constitutional Criminal Procedure, by Professor Joshua Dressler, its pages flagged with dozens of sticky notes marking key cases, Terry v. Ohio, Graham v. Connor, Tennessee v. Garner. She'd memorized the relevant passages weeks ago, but the book itself had become a talisman, a reminder of the weapons she carried that couldn't be seen or confiscated. She stood before the bathroom mirror and rehearsed. Calm tone, never aggressive, never defensive, just persistently reasonable. Steady eye contact, not challenging, but not submissive either. The legal citations had to roll off her tongue naturally, as if she were simply educated rather than prepared. Officer, under Terry v. Ohio, you need reasonable articulable suspicion of criminal activity to detain me. What specific violation am I being accused of? She practiced it 5 times, adjusting her inflection until it sounded less like recitation and more like genuine inquiry. Her phone's camera captured a series of time-stamped photographs, her face unmarked, her wrists without bruises, her white button-up blouse crisp and professional. Evidence of her condition before the encounter. Before whatever came next. This was day 23 of establishing the pattern, same pharmacy, same time window, same predictable routine that would make her a target. The incident reports she'd collected through FOIA requests showed the profile clearly: black residence, middle-class presentation, assertive but not aggressive, usually alone. The kind of people who looked like they might know their rights, who might file complaints, who needed to be reminded of their place. She double-checked the recording pen's battery indicator. Full charge. 4 hours of continuous recording. Today felt different. Today felt inevitable. Laura grabbed her keys and headed for the door, her heart steady with the certainty of someone walking deliberately into fire. Officer James Whitman entered the pharmacy at 2:26 p.m. with the bearing of a man who had already written the ending to this story. He didn't pause at the entrance to assess the situation. Didn't scan for actual threats or disturbances. His eyes found Laura immediately, a black woman at a pharmacy counter, and his jaw set into a hard line that suggested this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment dispatch called his unit. Behind him, Officer Chen looked younger, uncertain, his hand hovering near his radio rather than his weapon. Chen's eyes darted between Laura, Trevor, and the other customers who had suddenly become very interested in reading vitamin bottle labels. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough that even the fluorescent light seemed to hum with it. Whitman approached with deliberate intimidation, each step calculated to establish dominance. He entered Laura's personal space, standing close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to maintain eye contact, using his 6'2" frame to loom over her 5'6". His hand rested on his duty belt, fingers drumming against the leather in a gesture that drew attention to everything he carried: gun, taser, handcuffs, baton. "I'm going to need you to step back from the counter, ma'am, right now." The words carried no inflection of inquiry, no curiosity about what had actually occurred. Just command, absolute and unquestionable. This was authority that expected immediate compliance, that had never learned the difference between respect and fear. Laura felt her heart rate spike, 124 beats per minute. She could feel the acceleration, but years of preparation steadied her voice. "Officer, I'm simply waiting for my prescription to be filled." "What specific violation am I being accused of?" Laura watched Whitman's face flush deeper red as she finished citing Terry v. Ohio, explaining in measured tones that without reasonable articulable suspicion of criminal activity, she was not obligated to comply with his arbitrary commands. The legal terminology seemed to enrage him more than defiance would have. It was one thing to be disobeyed, another thing entirely to be corrected. You want to play lawyer? Whitman's voice rose sharp enough that other customers flinched. Fine. Turn around. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and disorderly conduct. Laura's analytical mind catalogued the absurdity even as it unfolded. She had obstructed nothing, no investigation was occurring. She had been disorderly in no way, her voice had remained level, her demeanor calm. But she also knew that physical resistance would only provide the justification he was looking for, would give him the excuse to escalate from illegal arrest to necessary force. She turned slowly, placing her hands behind her back. I am complying with your arrest under protest. For the record, I have not committed any crime. Whitman grabbed her wrists with deliberate roughness, yanking them together hard enough that Laura felt something in her shoulder strain. The handcuffs clicked shut too tight, metal biting into skin. She kept her voice steady for the recording pen still running in her pocket. Officer James Whitman, badge number 2847, you are arresting me without probable cause. I have committed no crime. I am noting that you are applying excessive force to the handcuffs. The pressure is cutting off circulation. Officer Chen shifted uncomfortably near the door. Whitman, maybe we should just go wait by the car, Chen. Whitman's tone brooked no argument. Now. Chen hesitated for 3 full seconds, long enough for Laura to see the calculation in his young face, the moment he chose self-preservation over intervention, then he pushed through the pharmacy door into the afternoon heat. Once Chen was gone, Whitman reached up with his free hand. Laura watched his finger find the small button on his body camera, saw the tiny LED indicator light blink once and go dark. The camera that should have been recording everything, the accountability measure that should have protected both officer and citizen, deliberately deactivated. Officer Whitman has deactivated his body camera, Laura said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the pharmacy. The time is 2:37 p.m. Whitman leaned close, his breath hot against her ear. Keep talking, he whispered. See where it gets you. The threat was explicit, undeniable. Behind them, the customer with the phone was still recording, her hands shaking but her camera steady. Trevor had disappeared into the back room. Another customer near the cold medicine aisle pretended to study a box of Dayquil while his jaw clenched tight. Laura felt the handcuffs bite deeper as Whitman pulled her toward the exit, but her mind was already 3 steps ahead, already cataloging every violation, already building the case that would bring all of this into the light. Sign this, and you walk out tonight. No charges filed. Clean record. Like this never happened. Howell smiled, the expression meant to convey reasonableness. Why make this harder than it needs to be? You made your point. Let's all move on. Laura looked up at him with eyes that had spent 28 hours moving from anger to calculation to something much colder. When she spoke, her voice carried no emotion whatsoever, just clinical precision. Lieutenant Howell, I decline your offer. Instead, I want to file a formal complaint regarding Officer Whitman's conduct during my arrest, including the use of excessive force, the deliberate deactivation of his body camera, and my subsequent illegal detention without formal charges. She paused, letting each word land. I should also make you aware that I have recorded evidence of this entire encounter, from the pharmacy to this moment. You should preserve all related documentation immediately, as it will be subject to legal discovery. Howell's sympathetic expression cracked. His eyes hardened, the benevolent parent replaced by something much more calculating. That's. Ms. Bennett, you're making a serious mistake. Laura smiled without warmth, without humor. We'll see, Lieutenant. We'll see. They released her at 6:14 a.m. without ceremony or explanation. No charges filed. No paperwork. No apology. Laura walked out of Millbrook County Jail into the gray pre-dawn light with her ruined blouse and bruised wrists, and headed directly to the Sunrise Diner 3 blocks north. The all-night waitress, Denise, according to her name tag, brought coffee without being asked, took one look at Laura's appearance, and simply said, "Rough night, honey." Laura nodded, too exhausted for pretense, and ordered eggs she wouldn't eat. Her laptop emerged from her bag, miraculously undamaged despite everything. She opened the encrypted folder she'd been building for 7 months, files that had taken countless FOIA requests, public record searches, and conversations with community members who'd learned to document their own encounters with Millbrook PD. Now she had something they didn't: first-hand experience, recorded evidence, and the bruises to prove the pattern wasn't paranoia. She created a new spreadsheet, cross-referencing everything she knew with systematic precision. Officer James Whitman, 17 excessive force complaints over 4 years. 16 dismissed by Internal Affairs for insufficient evidence. 1 resulted in a sealed settlement, $75,000 paid to Marcus Henderson, accompanied by an NDA that kept the details buried. In 12 of the 17 cases, body cameras experienced technical malfunctions at critical moments. The probability of such consistent equipment failure was statistically impossible. Laura's hands moved faster, pulling up news articles, death certificates, accident reports. The pattern expanded beyond excessive force into something darker. 3 people who'd filed complaints against Whitman had died within 6 months. All ruled accidents or natural causes. All investigations closed quickly, quietly, efficiently. Then she found him, Terrence Morrison, 24 years old. A local news article from 6 months ago, buried on page 5, local man dies in single vehicle accident. The car had left the road on Highway 47, struck a tree, driver killed instantly. Excessive speed listed as the probable cause. The accident report that should have been attached to the article wasn't linked. She searched the county database, missing. Requested through FOIA, pending, indefinitely. Laura pulled up her timeline. Terrence Morrison had filed an excessive force complaint against Officer James Whitman on March 3, Internal Affairs had dismissed it for insufficient evidence on March 15, Terrence died on March 18, 3 days later. Her coffee had gone cold. Her hands were shaking as she typed notes into her encrypted file. This wasn't just systematic bias or even corruption. This was covering up something that looked increasingly like murder. The department wasn't just protecting bad officers, they were protecting criminals. The stakes had just changed from civil rights violations to life and death. And Laura realized with crystal clarity that she might be next. At 9:03 a.m., Laura walked back through the doors of Millbrook Police Department. She'd gone home first, showered, changed into fresh clothes, treated her bruised wrists with arnica cream, and made copies of everything on 3 separate drives stored in 3 separate locations. She'd also emailed her attorney with instructions: if anything happened to her, if she disappeared or had an accident, specific files were to be released immediately to the press, the state attorney general, and the FBI. Now she stood at the front desk with the posture of someone who'd come not to plead, but to declare war. "I need the formal complaint forms for filing against an officer." Her voice carried through the bullpen, intentionally loud enough that conversation stopped mid-sentence. The desk sergeant, Rodriguez, young enough to still look uncomfortable with the corruption around him, hesitated. "Ma'am, if you want to discuss what happened yesterday." "I don't want to discuss anything. I want the forms. It's my legal right to file a formal complaint." Rodriguez pulled out the paperwork, sliding it across the counter. Laura began filling it out with meticulous detail, each violation documented with timestamp and specific description: excessive force, false arrest, deliberate deactivation of recording equipment, illegal detention without formal charges or phone call access. Sergeant Howell emerged from his office, clearly unsettled to see her. "Ms. Bennett, I thought we had an understanding." Laura looked up from the form, her pen poised. "Sergeant Howell, I'm here to file a formal complaint regarding Officer Whitman's conduct during my arrest yesterday." She paused, letting him process that this wasn't going away. "I'm also here to inquire about another case that requires clarification." The bullpen had gone silent. Officers pretended to work at their computers while listening to every word. Terrence Morrison, Laura said clearly. He died 6 months ago in what was ruled a single-vehicle accident on Highway 47. The accident occurred 3 days after he filed an excessive force complaint against Officer James Whitman. I've submitted a FOIA request for the accident reconstruction report, but I wanted to inquire about the timeline for receiving that documentation. Howell's face drained of color. Behind him, an officer's coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. Another officer's fingers froze on his keyboard. The name had landed like a grenade. That case is closed, Howell managed, his voice strained. Laura nodded slowly, making a note on her complaint form. Closed. I understand. Please note for the record that I'm requesting all documentation related to Mr. Morrison's death, including the accident reconstruction report, witness statements, and internal communications. I'll be following up regularly. She finished filling out the complaint form with careful precision, signed it, and requested a stamped copy for her records. As she turned to leave, she heard Howell's voice behind her, low and urgent into his phone, "We have a problem." She knows about Morrison. Laura kept walking, her heart pounding but her face calm. She'd just told them she knew their darkest secret. Now she needed to stay alive long enough to prove it. 2 weeks later, Laura sat in a corner booth at Brewster's Coffee, watching the door while trying to look casual. Marcus Webb arrived exactly on time, which meant he was nervous. Punctuality was the habit of someone who didn't want to give anyone an excuse to remember them. He was thin, early 40s, with the kind of exhaustion that came from months of looking over your shoulder. He slid into the booth without ordering, glancing at the door twice before speaking. "I kept copies," he said quietly, his hands wrapped around a manila folder like it might escape. "They told me I couldn't, but I kept them anyway." Laura had found Webb through 3 degrees of separation, a former colleague who knew someone who knew about the accident reconstruction specialist who'd left Millbrook County Sheriff's Department under mysterious circumstances last April, right after Terrence Morrison's death. "Tell me what happened." Laura kept her voice low, non-threatening. Webb's jaw tightened. "They brought me Morrison's vehicle on March 19, single-vehicle collision, driver deceased. Standard reconstruction, I've done hundreds. But this one wasn't standard. The brake lines were severed. Not worn through, not corroded. Severed. Clean cut, tool marks visible under magnification." Laura's heart rate accelerated. "What did you put in your report?" "The truth. Initially." Webb's hands were shaking now. "I documented everything, the cut lines, the tool marks, the complete absence of any mechanical failure that would explain a severed brake line. My conclusion was clear, evidence consistent with intentional sabotage. I submitted it to my supervisor on March 21. And they made me rewrite it. Said I was jumping to conclusions, that brake lines could fail in lots of ways, that we didn't want to cause unnecessary distress to the family with speculation." Webb's voice cracked slightly. "They wanted me to change my conclusion to driver error, excessive speed, lost control. When I refused to destroy my original notes, I got put on administrative leave for insubordination. 3 weeks later, I resigned. It was either that or they were going to fire me and make sure I never worked in reconstruction again." He slid the folder across the table. Laura opened it with hands she forced to stay steady. Inside were photographs, high-resolution images of Terrence Morrison's brake lines, the cuts sharp and unmistakable. Tool marks scored the metal, clear as a signature. Webb's original report was there too, 10 pages of technical detail concluding with the devastating sentence, "The evidence is consistent with intentional sabotage. This was not an accident. Why are you giving this to me?" Laura asked, photographing each page with her phone under the table. Webb met her eyes for the first time. "Because Dorothy Morrison deserves to know what happened to her son. Because I see his face every night when I try to sleep. Because I couldn't live with myself anymore, knowing the truth and doing nothing." His voice dropped to a whisper. And because if they killed him, they'll kill someone else. Maybe they already have. Laura felt the full weight of it settle onto her shoulders. This wasn't just about discrimination or corruption anymore. This was conspiracy to cover up murder. And she was holding the proof. 3 months later, federal investigators arrived at Millbrook Police Department at 6 a.m. with sealed warrants and an unmistakable message. Laura stood on the courthouse steps beside Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Vance, watching as the department she deliberately provoked finally faced consequences it couldn't dismiss or bury. The press conference had been carefully choreographed. News vans lined the street, cameras already recording as federal agents emerged from the building with Officer James Whitman in handcuffs. His face was pale, his characteristic swagger replaced by the hunched posture of someone who'd finally learned what accountability looked like. Vance stepped to the microphone cluster, her voice carrying with prosecutorial authority. After a 7-month investigation into the Millbrook Police Department, the Civil Rights Division has found systemic violations of constitutional protections, including illegal detention, excessive force, and deliberate destruction of evidence. Today we are filing federal charges against 4 officers and seeking a consent decree requiring comprehensive oversight and reform. Laura watched from slightly behind the podium, her role finally revealed. She'd been working with Vance's office since January, gathering the personal testimony and documented evidence needed to break through the department's wall of silence. Her arrest had been the catalyst, the final, undeniable proof of pattern and practice. Sergeant Howell emerged in handcuffs moments later, flanked by 2 FBI agents. He saw Laura and his face hardened. "This is all speculation," he called out to the assembled press. "There's no evidence of any cover-up." Laura stepped to the microphone. Her voice was steady, clinical, devastating. "Sergeant Howell, I have the accident reconstruction report, the original report that Millbrook County suppressed." Terrence Morrison's break lines were deliberately cut. The investigator was pressured to falsify his findings. "We have his testimony, we have the photographic evidence, and we have communications showing you were aware of the true cause of death and chose to bury it." The second wave of arrests happened within 90 minutes. Howell and 2 supervising officers, charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. By noon, the police chief had resigned. By evening, the mayor was calling for a complete department review. The final scene unfolded 3 days later in a small living room in the East Side neighborhood. Dorothy Morrison sat across from Laura, reading the federal report with trembling hands. She was 58 but looked older, worn down by 6 months of grief and unanswered questions. When she finished reading, she looked up at Laura with eyes that held both devastation and relief. "They killed my baby," she whispered. "And they tried to make me believe it was his fault." "Yes, ma'am. They did." Laura's professional detachment, the clinical armor that had protected her through months of investigation, finally cracked. "I'm so sorry." Dorothy reached across the table and took Laura's hand. Her grip was strong despite the trembling. "You heard him," she said softly. "When no one else would listen, when they tried to make his death meaningless, you heard my boy." Laura felt tears she'd been holding for months finally break free. She squeezed Dorothy's hand back, allowing herself to feel the weight of it all, the grief, the rage, the exhaustion, the triumph. She hadn't just documented injustice or built a legal case. She'd given voice to someone who'd been silenced, restored truth where lies had taken root, and reminded herself that behind every data point and legal citation was a human being who mattered. "He mattered," Laura said. "Terrence mattered. And now everyone will know."